Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month, we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with critical theorist and political theorist Chris Cutrone. Chris teaches critical theory at the School of Art Institute in Chicago, as well as the Institute for Clinical Social Work. He completed his PhD on Adorno's Marxism at the University of Chicago, and he leads an organization called the Platypus Affiliated Society. I've had Chris on the channel last year to talk about his first book published with Sublation, which was focused on the death of the millennial left. So I'll leave a link in the description to that conversation if you want to check out the history of our conversations. But today we're going to be talking about his follow-up book to that, Death of the Millennial Left, which focuses on Marxism and politics. So this is a heavy theory book, and we're going to be going into the details with specifically how to think politics from a Marxist perspective. So welcome back to the channel, Chris. Maybe just give the viewers a little bit of an overview, a little bit of a sense of why you published this book, what this book is, and then we'll go into some of the details.
Great, thanks. So it is the sequel to The Death of the Millennial Left. So these 2 books are compiling my writings as a teacher in Platypus over the course of almost 20 years now, but 16 years, 18 years, 16 years in the case of The Death of the Millennial Left, 18 years in the case of Marxism and Politics. And they really are sort of 2 volumes of like one book. So even the cover art, it's one painting if you put them side by side. And so I basically divided it into the more like current events politics articles that I had written in this period versus the more historical and theoretical writings that I wrote around the same time, and the more pedagogical writings as opposed to the kind of commentary, So 2 different genres of essay, although there's some crossover between the 2 volumes because I needed to have a taste of the theory in the first book, and I needed to also have a taste of the current political situation in the second book. But it's kind of 1,000 pages, 100 articles. It's like that. So 250 pages in the book last year, 750 pages in the book this year. There's actually a 3rd volume that will be coming out with my writings on art and Marxism. And I'm not sure how long that's going to be, but it's going to be a sizable volume as well. And that's going to reach back into an earlier period before Platypus, but also include a lot of the things that I wrote during the time of Platypus that addressed art and culture from a Marxist perspective.
I'll be very interested in that. I'm not sure if you're aware of a Marxist theorist by the name of Robert C. Tucker, but I was really relying on some of his work in teaching Marxism in the Christian atheism course. And of course, he's focusing on myth, and he really brings up some dimensions of art and aesthetics that I thought were usually under-discussed and undervalued in most of the discussions I hear about Marxism. So I'm really interested to hear that you're going to have an entire book focused on art. I mean, where I want to start here is basically the French Revolution. And the reason why I want to start with the French Revolution is because most of my knowledge in the philosophy that I'm teaching at Philosophy Portal stems from German idealism. And of course, German idealism is enormously influenced by the French Revolution. And in many sense, that philosophy is both entangled with and inextricably linked to the French Revolution. And thinking about the contradictions that issue from that revolution. Now, Marx, as a thinker who's definitely situated in a milieu after German idealism, also seems to be responding to the social political dimensions that come out of the French Revolution. So, how do you understand the, let's say, the political dimensions of the French Revolution that figures like Kant and Hegel are struggling with, versus a figure like Marx, and what is Marx seeing and what is happening during Marx's time that perhaps lead him to different conclusions than a Kant or a Hegel on modern politics.
Right, that's a good point. I mean, it actually goes to the heart of what many would see as the uniqueness of my approach, and yet is actually something that's very kind of old-fashioned Marxism, which is a distinction between the bourgeois revolution and the struggle for proletarian socialism. It's something that I thematize in the book in my writing on Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács, but it's really a kind of a thread throughout the book. And there's an essay up front in the book called Capital and History that was written on the occasion of a panel discussion I participated in with Marxist humanists who think of themselves as Hegelian Marxists. And so I was making an intervention with respect to the relationship between Hegel and Marx, which, again, Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács are also seen as Hegelian Marxists, as returning to what Korsch called the philosophy of revolution. So linking Hegel and Marx as having that in common. They're both philosophers of revolution, or Hegelianism as a philosopher or as a philosophy of the French Revolution or of the bourgeois revolution more generally, and Marx as the philosopher of the proletarian socialist revolution. So the relation there, it goes back to an old idea, which was that the modern workers' movement for socialism was the inheritor of German idealism. It's a kind of a second international socialist Marxist idea, and what that might mean. Now, on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's also a critique in the history of Marxism of the Jacobin tradition, meaning, on the one hand, Lenin said that social democrats, he called them revolutionary social democrats. What he meant was revolutionary socialists, or he later said, we'll remove the fig leaf and just call ourselves communists. That the revolutionary social democrat as a Jacobin joined indissolubly to the workers' movement. So again, what this means is actually a very vexed question, because I think that the self-liquidation of Marxism in the 20th century, the kind of disappearance of Marxism in both practice and in theory, has as its corollary a theoretical liquidation of the distinction between the bourgeois revolution and the proletarian socialist revolution. So it's a kind of a reversion back to the Jacobin tradition. So I see it in those terms. I see it as, well, there's continuity and change between Hegel and Marx, between the Jacobin tradition and what Marx considered to be the proletarian socialist tradition in the 19th century that he was a critic of. And what it meant for Marx to be a critic of the proletarian socialism of his own time was that he thought that he was contributing a greater historical self-awareness of what they were really struggling for. So basically the idea is something like this. The proletarian struggle for socialism will necessarily misrecognize itself as a kind of bourgeois radical democratic revolutionary consciousness. So it will be, struggling for the rights of labor, struggling for democracy, struggling against the arbitrariness of the state, struggling against the arbitrary privileges of the ruling class. In other words, it'll be a replay of the revolt of the Third Estate. Right? So there's a thinker associated with the French Revolution. He's the writer of the greatest most influential revolutionary pamphlet in 1789, the Abbé Sieyès, who said, well, the Third Estate, so everyone who's not a nobility or a clergy, is defined by doing work, by performing labor. That And he said, really, society is the third estate, and then you have these privileged castes, these privileged orders, who don't work and who are therefore illegitimate as a ruling class. And you can see how the modern workers' movement for socialism in the era of industrial capitalism poses its perspective, its demands, its complaint, its discontent in those terms, in the exact same terms. So what's the difference, right? So the difference is that the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution, Hegel, Kant, also of the American Revolution, that it's a consciousness that is built upon hundreds of years of prior history. So it's built on the Enlightenment, the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, but also more generally the modern bourgeois tradition going back to the Renaissance. And for Marx, the idea is he does agree with Hegel that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, that consciousness comes late, meaning that the process of transforming society from a subsistence agricultural civilization to a modern society of production for commerce through the social relations of labor, bourgeois society, that took hundreds of years, and that a clear consciousness of what that was didn't come until the end of that process of transformation. So at first it's misrecognized in terms of a kind of classicism, like the Greeks and the Romans, and then it's misrecognized as a kind of radical apostolic fundamentalist Christianity, like a return to true Christianity against the corruption of the church. Protestantism, the Protestant revolt, was bound up in the bourgeois revolution very clearly. But then, as Marx put it, Habakkuk became Locke, right? So an ancient prophet became a modern Enlightenment philosopher. So John Locke replaced Habakkuk. So that first, the consciousness of this transformation of bourgeois society is in terms of the Bible, and then it becomes Lockean, the emergence of a kind of modern materialist empiricism and a different notion of social right. Because, of course, Locke very famously said that property is not based on might. It's not because the nobles seize the land that it belongs to them, but rather it's because the peasants work the land that it belongs to the peasants and not to the aristocracy. Right? So again, the rights of labor, right?
Well, I think that there's a number of salient points there, and in terms of the direction of my thinking, and perhaps the link between some of the connections that you're making there. And I just want to highlight this dimension of the Owl of Minerva as a point of agreement with Marx and Hegel, but of course then Marx forwarding a type of thought that usually gets symbolized as the Gaelic rooster, and as sort of like announcing the proletarian revolution, as opposed to just sort of reflecting on what has transpired over the previous 100 years. And then in regards to, this let's say tradition of Marxism that goes back to Hegel as well, and perhaps tries to see Marx from the perspective of Hegel. Is there any justification in seeing the Owl of Minerva and the Gaelic Rooster as in some sort of feedback loop with each other, that we need both
Mm.
modes of
Mm.
subjectivity as opposed to just one? Or how do you think the relationship between these two modes of thinking, I guess you could say, because it seems to me to cut right to the issue of the relationship between philosophy and politics?
It does. That's right. It has to do with the relationship between even theory and practice, we could say. So, okay. So another phrase of Marx is that the revolution of the 19th century has to take its poetry from the future, whereas the revolution of the 18th century took its poetry from the past. Again, like the American and French Revolution, they really understood what they were doing in terms of classical republicanism, whether ancient republic or kind of more Renaissance thinking, much less so than with the Dutch Revolt or the English Civil War, which really understood itself in terms of Protestantism. That the 18th century did have a more kind of secular, historical, kind of inframundane consciousness, but it was still the consciousness of the past. Whereas the revolution of the 19th century, according to Marx, had to take its poetry from the future, right? So, and that's a very strange formulation because what he's saying is it's more kind of a feeling, a spirit, an intuition, rather than a blueprint, right? Because he's very much against the idea of a blueprint for socialism or communism. So he's saying we have to take our spirit not from the past, but from the future, but at the same time not according to a kind of a dogmatic blueprint. So it's very tricky, right? So I would say that the way I lay it out in the book in various essays is that in modern industrial capitalism, that really is capitalism for Marx. So there's a reason why you wouldn't have a proletarian struggle for socialism before Marx's own time, before the industrial era of the 19th century. Because, in fact, the possibility of socialism, the possibility of overcoming bourgeois social relations, didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. And so socialism was neither possible nor was it historically necessary. What was necessary was the emancipation of the bourgeois social relations of labor, nor was it desirable, because in fact, you needed the bourgeois social relations of labor to develop the forces of production. So it was neither possible, necessary, nor desirable, whereas it does become all three of those things in the 19th century. So that's where, again, Marx defined capitalism as the contradiction of bourgeois social relations, which are the social relations of labor, including bourgeois property relations, property based on labor, contradicted by the industrial forces of production. In the 20th century, this became hypostasized as private property rights in capital, that's bourgeois social relations, and then industrial technique, science and technology in the factory, that's the industrial forces of production. It was very concretized. That was a really undialectical posing of things. So it's really what is the case. We live still in bourgeois society, in bourgeois social relations. Everyone still makes claims for their rights on the basis of labor, essentially, that they want to be participants, contributors equally, and have their rights respected as part of social cooperation and production. But that this is contradicted by the potential of the industrial forces of production that are held back, that are constrained. And that it's not just about, nationalizing the means of production and then that's it. Because, of course, the production that we have now, capitalist production, is contradictory production. So Marx looked forward to a qualitative transformation of production. It's not like you just get rid of the capitalists and just let the industry that we have go wild. No. A qualitative change in the way we even use science and technology socially. So there is a utopian dimension to it, meaning it's not about, okay, let the science and technology that we have in capitalism, let that go unhindered, right? Just get rid of the capitalists, put it in the hands of the state, and then let it rip. No, the idea was that this would be a qualitative transformation of production itself. So it's not just redistributing the products of or the utilization of the industry that we have now, but really a much more qualitative transformation. So this is really crucial because what Marx derives from this idea is that whereas the political revolutions associated with the emergence of bourgeois society come late, and a clear consciousness of their stakes comes late, that really the proletarian socialist revolution comes early, and it's still capitalism. So the dictatorship of the proletariat, like the workers seizing the means of production, is still capitalism. And you can't abolish capitalism immediately, but only gradually over time. Now, how long? His perspective and perspective of someone like Lenin was that maybe a generation at most, like a few decades, like not centuries. No, right? A few decades. And that really that would be a political process. In other words, it's not waiting for technological advancement. It would be a political process. Um, so again, it's not waiting for some quantitative increase in technology, it's waiting for a qualitative change in the way we use technology socially. So that contradiction between the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production persists into the period after the working class has seized the means of production and taken state power. That contradiction persists. So, what that means is that bourgeois philosophy, bourgeois political thought, bourgeois enlightenment still pertains today and would still be applicable after the revolution, but it's actually been contradicted. And so we experience it very differently. So what you and I have in common, part of what you and I have in common is Theory Underground. And, they are open to like non-Marxist perspectives like Heidegger and other things associated with like postmodernism. And my understanding of all of that is, well, of course, a kind of anti-Hegelian strain emerged in the 20th century that associated Marxism with bourgeois society and capitalism, saw like the need for a more radical philosophy that went deeper than Marxism did. That this is what animated Heidegger and his followers. And there's validity to that insofar as then Marxism in the Soviet Union and in other places basically like engaged in a kind of pseudo-Hegelianism to justify everything that they were doing. And to see history as this kind of process of successions of modes of production. And, yes, people are sacrificed to that process, but we can't be sentimental about it. We have to be scientific. So it fell to like Heidegger and the postmodernists to say, what do we even mean by science? What do we even mean by technology? To raise those qualitative questions that actually were there in the original Marxism, but got forgotten because Marxism was reduced to a state ideology and that pursued productivism, that pursued industrialization. So it's very tricky because again, why would we want to go back to the Hegelian roots of Marxism? Well, you could do it as a kind of right Hegelian, like affirmation of history in its necessary unfolding, or you could reach back to the more kind of radical Hegel, the more revolutionary Hegel. So the left and right Hegelian split shows up in Marxism itself. I bring that up because Lukács and Korsch and also the Frankfurt School are associated with this kind of left Hegelian interpretation of Marxism, as opposed to what they considered the Stalinist kind of right Hegelian or conservative Hegelian distortion of Marxism. Now, you could also say it shouldn't be Hegelian at all. You could be like Althusser and say it should be scientific, it should be based on a totally different epistemology altogether. But leaving that to one side, again, I see it as what's the relationship between the bourgeois revolution and the proletarian struggle for socialism? Maybe just to make it very clear politically, I think that as long as we have capitalism, there will be political crisis, there will be political upheaval, there will be civil wars, coups d'etats, revolutions. This will happen in all the countries of the world as long as we're still in capitalism. It has happened in the last 200 years in nearly all countries. It will continue to happen. Those revolutions will be bourgeois revolutions. There will be democratic revolutions. There will be uprisings of the people against the state and against the ruling class. Will they get beyond capitalism? Not without the working class constituted as a force for establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's not like the bourgeois revolution belongs to the past. It's still very much with us. It's very much with us. We're talking on election day here in the United States. The Trumpian Republican Party, they are very passionate about 1776, right? Getting back to the spirit of 1776, and don't cancel Thomas Jefferson. He's a revolutionary. He gave us freedom. Well, that's all to be expected. And there was a time when the left used to do that. Like in the 60s, they also did that. They reached back to the American Revolution And in the 30s, they also did that, reach back to the spirit of the American Revolution. That's all true, but from a Marxist perspective, that's ideological and it's a misrecognition. It's a partial recognition of what's going on, but without including the fact that actually that's not going to be adequate. That's not going to be sufficient to deal with the problem of capitalism. That can renew capitalism. You can have a radical democratic revolution. You can have an overthrow of the ruling class and the state and a reformulation of things, bring forward a new ruling class, a new state. It's not going to get us beyond capitalism. So it's still there. And a proletarian socialist revolution is going to be a bourgeois revolution. It is. So there are going to be these two moments. And it goes to the way Marx understands capitalism itself as a contradictory historical social formation that has two spirits in it. It has the spirit of the past, the bourgeois revolution, that tradition. We do live in a revolutionary society. All that is solid melts into air. But the need also to transcend that tradition, to transcend that history, the poetry of the future. Right. So those two things coexisting in our reality and in any attempt to change our reality.
There's okay, so there's a fair amount there, and I'm gonna try and frame this in a way that brings it back to the next dimension of your book that I'd like to get into. But just to start, I just
Mm-hmm.
want to I want to leave a philosophical point that I've always struggled with Marxism, which is that our society is contradictory. Capitalism is a contradictory social formation, like you've been saying. But then is there an idea, and I just want to leave this question before moving on
Mm-hmm.
to sort of another framing, is like in this idea of moving towards um a form of revolution that's driven by the dictatorship of the proletariat and the establishment of a post-capitalist mode of production, do we enter into, is the hypothesis that we enter into a different type of contradiction, or that we enter into a non-contradictory or a post-contradictory type of society? That's just maybe a question I'd like to leave there, and maybe you can respond to it. But on the level of
Mm-hmm.
your emphasizing the qualitative social transformation, which I think is connected to this idea of the contradiction, in this qualitative social transformation, I'd like to go into what leftist politics means here, because in your book, and this is
Mm-hmm.
deeply connected to your line of thought when you're saying the death of the millennial left. It's almost like the death of the millennial left is unable to really think leftist politics towards its own beyond of itself. But
Mm-hmm.
you state that Marx, in regards to leftist politics, he only identifies with leftist politics insofar as that it points beyond itself, and that it sort of is tarrying with the imminent contradictions of capitalism from within capitalism, opposed to pretending it's beyond capitalism. I think that's really an important point. And then you're emphasizing to me now that this is not to be thought of or conceived in technological terms, but social terms. But in my thinking, and here, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but in my
Mm-hmm.
thinking, I I'm a subject of my time, produced by my time, just as much as Marx and Hegel were produced by their time. And I really got caught up into the discourses of the technological singularity when I was young,
Uh-huh.
and some
Right.
of, and the ideas that were circulating there do, I think, have some relationship to Marxism, insofar as that many of the discourses around automation do really get to the heart of the transformation of industrial society. And even, like, you brought up Theory Underground, someone like Dave working at an Amazon factory, where basically he's just tending to these robots that are doing most of the things that industrial laborers would have been doing 100 years ago. And there is this idea of, well, what's the logic of this process in the 21st century, and how does that change the relationship between laborers, or even just the value of labor as such? Now, that might be taking it too far afield, but how are you thinking about the relationship between the qualitative transformations of modes of production, and perhaps waves of automation, and And then connected to that, the original point I was bringing up about how are we to think contradiction in relationship to this qualitative transformation?
Right. So a couple of things. So one would be I do have a chapter of the book where I collected my writings on capitalism per se. So in there's a piece called What is Capitalism that was actually three pieces that I published, little short essays, one of which is called Robots in Sweatshops. And I think that again, what I learned from Marxism, really via the Frankfurt School, but then I found it in Marx and Engels' writings and also in like Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg, and Lenin, and also who I mentioned earlier, Georg Lukács and Karl Korsch, the theory of regression. And again, what that meant was not linear, right? So not linear progress, neither linear regression, but actually a contradiction, a contradictory dynamic in history in the modern industrial capitalist era of progress and regress, or as Walter Benjamin put it, progress in technology but retrogression of society. And I do think that it has to play out at a social and political level. In other words, by turning to the technological per se, looking at concrete forms of production, but also looking at the economic, like looking at like literally the quantum measurement of time and energy, I think that that can be misleading because again, that it's not going to be changed at that level. So it's not going to be, when you were just speaking, I was thinking about like, Aaron Bastani, fully automated luxury space gay communism, right? That being an important kind of millennial consciousness. But there's also, both before, during, and after the millennial left, there's also anarcho-primitivism, right? There's that, and my point would be again going back to Marx and going back to the old Marxist tradition. It's always going to be both. In other words, the discontents in capitalism, and I think more recently you have, I think it's Sato, who's a younger Marxologist, who uh, is talking about degrowth communism, right? And so you're always going to have, well, we should grow our way to communism, kind of linear progress, or we should degrowth our way to communism, right? We should pursue this technological axis of achieving communism, or we should avoid that and degrowth. Again, that latter approach would be more in touch with what I'm raising about a qualitative transformation. So the discontents and the potential future of capitalism do point in contradictory directions. They point in the direction of like automating our way out of labor social relations. But they also, there is a strong current of anarcho-primitivism or kind of petty bourgeois, like small production localism. And of course, now there's a combination of both because technology has been, in the neoliberal era, decentralized. And so it allows for very high tech, but more subdivided, localized production, as opposed to the huge centralized factory production of the past. Although there's still a lot of that. Like, we can't ignore that that still exists. Right. So what I would say is that we're not going in one or the other directions, either automatically through capitalism, nor should our aspirations be in either of those directions. But we need to understand that capitalism is moving in both directions. It's both growing and undoing and degrowing production, and that emancipation lies in both and neither of those directions. Meaning, again, it's not that we need to like shrink the population, lower consumption, right? Nor is it we want to give everyone a flying car and live on Mars, right? So it's neither of those things, although it's going to appear as either or both of those things, but it's neither of those things. So that gets to the point of contradiction, which is a more philosophical point. So this is, Adorno, and in the Theory Underground anthology of writings, underground theory. My contribution there, I was very judicious about my selection, so it's included in the Marxism and Politics book. It's the negative dialectic of Marxism. How is the Marxist or Marxian dialectic different from the Hegelian dialectic? And from Adorno, I get the idea and he got it from Benjamin, and Benjamin gets it from Lenin and Luxemburg and others, Marx and Engels. Um, Again, that maybe the dialectic is itself historically specific to capitalism. Or, as Marx put it very early on in 1844, the critique of the Hegelian dialectic and philosophy as a whole, he says the Hegelian dialectic is a metaphysics of labor. Meaning the reason that philosophy didn't exist before bourgeois society and before bourgeois society attained a certain level of self-consciousness is that, of course, medieval subsistence agriculture was not a dialectical society. It was not. And that suggests that maybe beyond capitalism also means beyond the dialectic. Right? So again, we tend to think of philosophy in transhistorical, atemporal, eternal truth terms. And well, what about the fact that okay, so Hegel is right. Reality is dialectical, but maybe that's our reality in our historical moment, and it wasn't before, and it's not going to be after. So that the point would be, as Adorno put it, that a society beyond capitalism would be neither a system nor a contradiction. Right? So the whole conception that we have of our world, of our universe, as a systematic totality that is constituted and reconstituted through contradiction and through dialectical movement, that maybe that is very specific to bourgeois society, still applying to the capitalist era, but that the goal is to get beyond that, to move into a non-systemic and non-contradictory, certainly, but even non-dialectical world. That's really the goal.
Like I can't help the first chain of associations that's coming to my mind is related to Deleuze. And actually
Sure.
there's a book. There's a book coming out. I unfortunately the name of the author slips my mind, but it's basically the book's title is Communism After Deleuze. It's coming out next year.
Yeah. Right.
And I can't help but think that
Mm-hmm.
what this book might be pointing towards, Communism After Deleuze, is kind of emphasizing that the beyond of capitalism is also beyond the dialectic, that
Yes.
the beyond of capitalism is beyond even thinking in terms of contradiction.
Right.
And of course, with Deleuze, you have this idea of the essential difference, and you have the idea that difference is actually going to become sort of the central term organizing thought.
Mm-hmm.
Um, before going on to another chain of associations, I also wanted to say that this relationship between Hegel and Marx on the level of, let's say, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as a model of spiritual psychology versus Marx's idea that it's more a labor process.
Yes.
That this actually maps in a very interesting way, and I'm again struggling to remember the exact thinker who's I think it was actually Robert Tucker who said
Mm.
that in phenomenology of spirit the final term is absolute knowing, but that
Yes.
Marx uses this and grafts this onto world communism.
Yes.
That the form of subjectivity in world communism would be a type of absolute knowing in the sense of a one that's in a certain comfort with the becoming other of itself.
Yes.
And perhaps that this becoming other to itself is key to this beyond of thinking in terms of contradiction, that we think in terms of contradiction in sort of the phenomenological struggle, but that in absolute
Right.
knowing, world communism, this doesn't necessarily structure the nature of our process, and maybe it
Yes.
is a different relationship to difference. I mean, I could ask a question there, but I mean, if there are any
Let me
ideas there
say a
that are
couple
of
of things.
philosophical interest.
Yes, that's right. So what I mentioned earlier about Deleuze, and the postmodernists more generally, although this would be a controversial kind of characterization because, postmodernism was sort of divided. I would say this is the kernel of truth in postmodernism. But it does point to the issue of what do we mean by difference and what's the actual nature and character of difference and the desideratum of difference in capitalism. So very simply, I think that there was a revolt against Hegel in the 20th century as a totalizing thinker who denied difference and who basically made the universal override the particular. I don't think that that's fair to Hegel, but again, in the context of the way Marxism as a kind of Hegelianism was mobilized by official communism and by, as a state ideology in the East, it's understandable how people would revolt against that and would, reject that. Now, again, all of this I see as progeny of Heidegger, and so difference. So I think that we have two maybe competing notions of difference. One is difference in origin, and the other would be difference in result, meaning heterogeneity, so that things are actually have different sources, and what Adorno called diverse multiplicity. In other words, that we produce difference, that we don't start out different, but we become different. That maybe we start out the same, like including as a species, right? We start out the same and we generate through history difference. So the difference isn't there, but we generate it. And then its status in capitalism, it's why, why would people, including the millennials now and even younger people, are fascinated by race theory again? They are. It's very creepy because they're like, well, what about this essential difference? Aren't blacks and whites different? And it's like, well, how do you understand that difference? Because of course you're going to exaggerate it, but also it's a historical difference. It's a difference, there are many ways of looking at it. Is it cultural? Is it biological? Like, what are we talking about here? In other words, how is history embedded? And you could get a kind of weird social Darwinism where it's embedded in our biology. Historical difference and cultural difference becomes part of our biology. Sure. But again, it really, this fixation on difference, I would associate with a 60s New Left revolt against a kind of high industrial capitalism of the 20th century and against the conformism and political authoritarianism associated with that. And that continues into neoliberalism. It gives us all sorts of identity politics. It gives us all sorts of like kind of radical difference concerns. And I think that what happens is that cause and effect get swapped, get confused. And rather than thinking of difference as a desired outcome, it's seen as a point of origin. That we sort of originate in different places, and then capitalism sort of throws us together in this oppressive way and homogenizes everything. No, maybe we start out homogeneous, and then the goal is diverse multiplicity, the production of difference. And so, but the only model, the only way that we can think of that desired outcome, that desired future, is with respect to the past. So before world history and universal history came into being in the bourgeois era, in an emancipatory way and in an oppressive way in capitalism, we think, oh, well, we're unhappy in this society, so maybe we should want to go back to when Germans were Germans and Jews were Jews and whatever else. Celts were Celts. I mean, God knows, right? It really goes deep. And so I would say that's a misrecognition of a desired future. It's a kind of mythologized past. It's a mystified past that is actually a misrecognized desire for a future where we do overcome the way capitalism oppresses us So to put it in Adorno terms, it would be universal history exists. I think the way he puts it is universal history must be construed and denied. So universal history exists, but maybe it is now in capitalism a universality of oppression and domination by capital. So that what we all have in common, people around the world, is that we all have a need to overcome capitalism. That is our universal condition. And that once we overcome that, then we will be free to develop new ways of being different, right? Not return to old ways of being different, not return to old, like, atavistic nations and races and religions, but really diverse multiplicity. That would be the freedom beyond capitalism. But again, it's liable to be misconstrued as, oh, capitalism is trying to force the round peg into the square hole. It's trying to make things similar that are different. And it's like, well, no, it's creating the possibility of becoming different, but not in a way that we can celebrate just right now, right? Because right now we only get a sort of intimation of it, and we only get the most constrained and deformed version of the kind of difference that could potentially be brought about. In capitalism, we just get a kind of, re-scrambling of the bourgeois social relations at a concrete level.
Now, I can play the role of, well, first let me say, I'm personally sympathetic with a lot of what you're saying there. If I was to put on my Deleuzean cap, what I would say is that you're starting out with the view on difference that's making this difference between origin and result, which is very Hegelian. It's built into the phenomenology. And so I think Deleuze might even, I don't know if Deleuze himself would take issue of this distinction between origin and result, but I just want to preface that as sort of saying that perhaps some Deleuzians would take issue with that. The other sort of dimension of things is that I think, you're talking about this revived interest in race theory. And of course, race is also very much in the popular consciousness since the 1960s. And you have some great lines in your book about, for example, how this appears as privileging sort of cultural differences on the left since the 1960s in a way that's sort of obfuscating the political dimension of that. And you've got some like great quotes from like Susan Sontag, who's saying like white people are like a cancer on the face of the earth. And then Adorno saying things like, savages are not necessarily more noble. And this sort of tension we still see very much active in political discussions today. I just want to sort of highlight the potential that in this dimension of thinking about Hegel's spiritual psychology and the master-slave dynamic, and perhaps also thinking about Marx's notion of slave society, that the way in which we frame differences in the process of the origin becoming a result could fall into we always put it into some hierarchical difference, some asymmetry, where we want to either imagine ourselves as higher or imagine ourselves as lower. And that this might be like some feature of our psychology, that we do this, that we tend to like take the multiplicity of differences and perhaps to sense make, perhaps to get some coherence, we frame these asymmetries in a master-slave dynamic, perhaps as a process of our own trying to make sense of our own self-consciousness. But I think that maybe this maybe this is emerging because of global plurality, and that's becoming
Mm-hmm.
sort of more and more on the a point of conversation, especially in some sort of and this is definitely related to something I wanted to bring up with you. This tidal wave of anti-liberal, anti-enlightenment thinking, which
Yep.
is kind of framing things as this let's go back. I was just listening to a conversation with a university professor on Nietzsche who was actually saying the period of liberal enlightenment was like a historical blip in an otherwise particularist human species landscape, and that we're going
Right.
back to a
Right.
particularist human species
Right.
landscape. And I think that this, now I want to, because this is where I really wanted to talk to you about this, is the way you're framing it in Marxism and politics is actually that Lenin and other figures in the Marxist movement were not anti-liberal, were not
Right.
necessarily anti-enlightenment, but rather wanted to bring liberalism to its result,
Right.
which was socialism. It was the realization of liberalism, not the antithesis. And so
Right.
so I think getting this right, to me, in my own writings as well, this is becoming very important, is so getting this right, how do we think the relationship between liberalism and socialism? And I think, if I could frame it in the context of your book, that we're still kind of, our political discussions are still kind of in the aftermath of 1848, and thinking about the
Sure.
crisis of social democracy and capitalism, and maybe the dialectics of liberalism, socialism in relationship to difference and universality. There's a lot
Mm-hmm.
there, but I'm sure you can make
Mm-hmm.
something out of it.
So one of my old mentors. So I talk about this in actually The Death of the Millennial Left. I talk about my mentors and my mentors in Marxism, in my paths to Marxism. I talk about uh, the Spartacus League, Adolf Reed, Moise Postone, and then Adorno, who sort of transcends all of those, because Adorno was there with me at least from the time of the end of my experience with the Spartacus League and when I was getting to know Adolf Reed. So Adolf Reed, he's known as like a critic of like racial politics, particularly black racial politics. But in fact, what very few people know about Adolf Reed is that he has a Frankfurt School background, as well as a liberal political science background, and that he has also a council communist background. So he was the one who told me to read Karl Korsch, Marxism and Philosophy, and also encouraged me to read Adorno's Negative Dialectics. So, you know, going all the way back to when I was first out of college, and he wrote an essay that I consider to be quite canonical for his work called Black Particularity Reconsidered. It's from the late 1970s. And he starts off with the question of mass society, mass politics, and homogenization versus difference. And he just says very simply that how capitalism homogenizes is through particularization. In other words, how do you integrate blacks? By particularizing them in their difference. That's actually the way that you do it, right? So, in other words, it's a dialectic of universal and particular. It's a dialectic of homogenization and heterogeneity. And so, what he said was, you know, maybe the Black Revolt was only a Black Revolt insofar as it was about integration into capitalism, and that the way this integration was going to be handled, the way the assimilation indeed was going to be handled, was through particularization. In other words, black nationalism was going to be the way that you integrate blacks into the Democratic Party. Right? So, you know, and again, this is core dialectical Marxism, we might say. And so the antinomy that we face in terms of identity politics is, do you stand on the side of your difference, or are you trying to join the universal? And more like Adolf basically like made me very conscious of this, and then Moise Postone later also his reading of Marx, you know, and they're both new leftists, they're both living through the era of postmodernism and the era of identity politics. They, you know, keyed me into this idea of, well, these antinomies are actually two sides of the same thing. You know, that it's not race or class or gender or class, because in fact, how can you separate these things? These are the same thing appearing in two different ways, two different complementary ways. And so I think that I had this insight granted to me at a very early age that the political ideologies that seem so urgent and so kind of divisive, polarizing, are not what they appear to be, not what they seem to be. And so again, the choice is not between blacks becoming the same and blacks like particularizing themselves, but indeed that by turning themselves into an ethnic group, from going from a racialized caste of subordinated laborers to becoming a ethnic group, going from black to African American, that was the way they were being integrated into capitalism, politically and socially and culturally, right? Because he also, he had read his Benjamin and Adorno, so he said, well, actually, all the niche marketing in the culture industry, like what kind of music do you listen to, what kind of culture do you like? That really it's just flavors of commodities, and that this is the way everything is reduced to a commodity through that kind of particularization. That would go all the way up to, like, I don't know, fundamentalism in our time, religious fundamentalism in our time. That maybe it's actually a function of a kind of modernization and a kind of integration, meaning that maybe the way Islam is modernized is through being fundamentalized, in the same way that Christianity had originally been modernized by being fundamentalized in the Protestant revolt. And that in fact, you know, when they sent the hit squad to go kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, what they find him and his cronies doing? Well, they were consuming the same internet porn that men in the United States do. They had hard drives full of internet porn in the same way that all dudes do in the United States or Europe, right? And yet, in the name of radical fundamentalist Islam, right? In the same way that, all the bros with the internet porn on their hard drives might be Christian fundamentalists or might be whatever, you know? So, I just feel like that, knowing that it ain't what it appears to be, knowing that this antinomy of particular and universal helped clear up a lot of things, because it meant that, we're not moving into a future of like balkanized nationalism, or if we do, it's actually going to be the way that people are being brought closer together. So I don't see, or another example would be like Hindutva, like Hindu nationalism in India. The appeal of that, it's not like some return to Hinduism. It really isn't. It's more like turning Hinduism into a commodity. And it's a political kind of integration move. In other words, how do you politically integrate India? Well, you do it on this kind of Hindu nationalist basis. It's very fraught and dangerous and violent and awful, but that it's not like, okay, India really is returning to its Hindu roots and is going to somehow decouple from the rest of the world and be its own thing, like Mahatma Gandhi thought. He thought we shouldn't, India should be India. It shouldn't really try to be part of the rest of the world. It should be itself. That's not where India is going, right? This is happening during an era of intense industrial economic development in India. That you have this
I
Hindu
guess
national.
I guess my fundamental orientation to this comes from, again, having been motivated since I was a young man in being interested in the technological singularity idea, and then in my doctoral program finding a research outlet which was actually opening up a more global anthropological analysis of technology as a phenomenon, and that my thesis was global brain singularity. And in that thesis, basically, I'm forwarding the idea that technological complexification and social integration is kind of this sort of, in some sense, an inevitable process, and that in that sense, these cultural reactions against it are actually epiphenomenal and impotent. So when I read something like Dugin's Fourth Political Theory, and he's sort of emphasizing this sort of Russian nationalism and this Russian Dasein and this Russian spirit, I see that as actually kind of just, again, epiphenomenal. Like, I'm not really sure what he's engaging with or interacting with. I'm not even sure if I should take it seriously, because I'm not sure if even his engagement with this discourse is going to have any meaningful consequences on what's actually happening socially and technologically. But it seems to me like what you're saying is that um, dynamics of global capitalism are bringing the world closer and closer together and making what seem to be particularist cultural differences kind of arbitrary, and that actually we are being sort of homogenized into the same matrix, and then that does confront us with something that does bring us some new type of unity, which is sort of this shared capitalist society, this shared capitalist condition, irrespective of if we're Russian or we're African or we're Indian or whatever. And so,
Or the
um,
ideology. I mean, Marxism is being used in China in order to integrate China into the capitalist world.
hmm hmm
You know, I mean, in other
um,
words, it's not the case that somehow communism is preserving Chinese cultural differences. No, it's destroying all internal cultural differences within China, and it's harmonizing China with the rest of the world. It's westernizing, Marxism westernized China in a way that had not taken place before that.
I'd be interested to know about whether or not the particularist cultural background in which Marxism is introduced, like in the difference between, let's say, Russia and China having a completely different theological and philosophical background, does that change the way in which Marxism is implemented or enacted as a praxis?
I mean, that's assuming that it ever was implemented as a praxis, but certainly I would say the revolutions in Russia and China, though they were led by ostensible Marxists, still had to deal with societies that were deeply culturally traditionalistic. And that creates this situation where we wonder, right? We wonder, okay, what is epiphenomenal? Is Marxism epiphenomenal? Was Marxism epiphenomenal in the Soviet Union, whereas what was really there was some kind of Slavic soul? Or, with China, is Marxism just epiphenomenal to the 2000-year mandate of heaven, to the oldest continuous civilization? And, I feel again that looked at not in terms of the past or the present, but in terms of a potential future. So I do think that in a place like Russia or in a place like China, there are going to be popular mobilizations, discontents, struggles for freedom, and that those struggles for freedom are going to reach for the French revolutionary tradition, let's say, the bourgeois revolutionary tradition, let's say. The Tiananmen Square protests had the Statue of Liberty, right? Which is a Franco-American, mythology, right? The gift of France to the United States to celebrate the shared revolutionary heritage. And that's what they reached for. And when they were having their blank paper protests, people were screaming in English, freedom of speech. So that's the way it's going to go. And guess what? The powers that be in those countries are going to suppress them as agents of Western imperialism, right? They're going to say these movements are like color revolution, like CIA plots, you know. But really, they'll be doing that on behalf of trying to maintain their local capitalist political order, right? So insofar as people in Russia or China have a renewed interest in Marxism, which I think they will have, it will be this universal history. It won't be a Duganite. So the way that I see that is, I could use the example of Germany. So Germany was relatively backward and integrated into the capitalist world in a kind of usual haphazard, chaotic way. It had a kind of Prussian autocracy that fell and became a kind of social democratic liberal democracy. And then the Nazis came in. And the Nazis tried to implement this radical German nationalist, atavistic, Aryan, paganistic ideology with like deep racism, exterminationist racism. And then after the Nazis fell, then Germany just became an ordinary European country. So it could very well be that this Duganite ideology among certain people in Russia, among like ruling class people in Russia, is just a flash in the pan before Russia becomes an ordinary capitalist country. And similarly, China, however one understands it, some kind of weird synthesis of Chinese cultural nationalism and Marxism It might reach a certain crescendo before China, most people in China adopt basically a kind of ordinary liberal democratic capitalist ideology. And that might go through upheavals and civil wars and what have you. But it might be that this kind of nationalist moment we're living through right now is not the future, but is rather the present and the lag of the past. And not the deep, deep past, but a kind of more recent past, meaning maybe nationalism had a comeback in Russia precisely because of the steep fall of Soviet communism. So maybe they had to reach for some kind of Russian nationalism, but maybe it's a very transitory phenomenon and it doesn't point to a kind of, deeply Russian nationalist future, but is just a sort of passing ideological prop of the state.
Now, what connected to that, another important ideas that I wanted to discuss with you and that you bring up in the book is the history of, let's frame this as the history of the relationship between Marx and Lenin and the historical crisis that this brings for Marxism as a historical phenomenon. And specifically in regards to the Russian Revolution, and you say there's all these thought taboos that have organized themselves around the Russian Revolution, that we don't think that, we can't think that. And in the context of Russia being, quote unquote, the weakest link in the system of world capitalism at the time of that revolution, but at the same time, this being actually kind of almost an unfortunate situation for Marxist theory, because you're saying here that the idea inherent to Marxism as a movement is that it would be a global revolution and not a sort of country specific revolution, and that the fact that the 1917 revolution happened in Russia was sort of a negative thing in the sense that the actual global revolutionary problem that Marxism introduced couldn't be solved in Russia. And so,
Right.
in that sense, there's this idea that actually, if communism was to take hold as a new system, that it would have to happen in the West, it would have to happen in America, or it would have to happen in Great Britain or Europe or something like that. So, how are you thinking the coordinates of this in terms of the legacy of Marxism and and the Russian Revolution, and then all of these thought taboos organizing around Marxism as kind of just like uh, this negative point of reference, and so we can't actually think this historical crisis of Marxism.
Right. So, of course, what comes to mind is like MAGA communism, a kind of neo Stalinism, a kind of weird reconciliation of like a kind of Stalinized Marxism with American nationalism. That's a phenomenon. That's a real phenomenon now. It's a kind of a Zoomer phenomenon, maybe a cusper phenomenon, a late millennial, but really a Zoomer phenomenon. And I just think, okay, well, where is that coming from? And, so it is going to look like every country has to reach back into its revolutionary tradition. But not all countries have a deep revolutionary tradition. The United States does. In Europe, there are deep revolutionary traditions. Obviously, in France, there's the French Revolutionary tradition. Um, and there's in the United Kingdom, there is a revolutionary tradition, however buried. Now, I would say that, again, that's very uneven on a world historical level. But when we're talking about trying to overcome capitalism, the workers seizing the means of production, well, the means of production are global, and they've been for a long time. So, and the workers of Russia could not seize the means of production in the United States, and yet they needed to. And how could they? Well, only with the workers in the United States. And so, one thing that occurs to me is Lenin, as a Russian revolutionary, he was steeped in Marxism, but also in Russian revolutionism, going back to the aftermath of the French Revolution, meaning there were sympathizers in Russia with the French Revolution. There was a local revolutionary tradition, which he saw the inadequacies of, but he still keyed into. So his famous book, What is to be Done, is based on a novel from the 19th century, Chernyshevsky. what is to be done. And it is about this Russian radical revolutionary tradition. So I think that, again, of course, local history participates in universal history, but we can't lose sight of the universal history. Now, the big danger is that capitalism is going to be seen in nationalistic terms, or it's going to be nationalized. I think that in my time, in the time also of the millennial left, in, let's say, late neoliberalism, I think Zizek talks about this, that there was this misapprehension that capitalism is essentially an Anglo-American thing. It's like the UK and the United States are capitalist, and no other countries are quite capitalist in the same way. That, the Washington Consensus neoliberalism, kind of free market capitalism is very Anglo and very American. And they try to make the entire world that way, but really no other countries are like that, or capitalist in that way. In which case, what are they? Well, they're kind of more nationalist than they are capitalist, right? So it's kind of like the British and the Americans don't have a culture. What they have is capitalism, and everyone else has a national culture that is more or less resistant to capitalism, right? And, so there was this kind of moment, we might say, at the beginning of the millennial left, like a kind of anti-globalization moment. And that has persisted now into a kind of neo-nationalist moment. And again, I'm wondering whether it's just reaching ahead before it dissipates, or are we really talking about the direction of the future? That we might take anti-neoliberalism or anti-globalism and hypostasize it and say, okay, the world went wrong when it tried to do neoliberal global capitalism, and the world was better when it was nationalistic, and so we should go back to that. Right? And, Trump preaching protectionism can be misconstrued as like, oh, he's like a white nationalist, white Christian nationalist, or American nationalist or something. And it's kind of like, well, no, tariffs are policies. Protectionism is a policy. It's not a way of like separating yourself from the rest of the world. It's actually a way of relating to the rest of the world. It's a kind of negotiation with the rest of the world. It's actually a way of being connected to the rest of the world. So I think that there's a lot that's kind of superimposed and jumbled up and kind of confused and mistaken in that. But we do need to look at why it looks like we're moving from a kind of globalized neoliberalism to a more national protectionist form of international capitalism, of world capitalism, that all countries are becoming more protectionistic and nationalistic. And, as opposed to what they were aspiring for 50 years of my lifetime, which was to become more globally integrated, more free market. Um, you know, so my old professor Moish Postone, he had this horrible vision that he was haunted by. He said maybe capitalism is just oscillating between liberal and nationalist phases. So it goes through kind of liberal globalistic phases and nationalistic phases. So one liberal globalistic phase was like the 19th century, then the 20th century is more nationalistic, and then the end of the 20th century is more globalistic, but maybe now we're just going to go back to nationalism. And I thought, well, that's kind of dreadful, especially because the nationalistic phases gave us World War I and World War II. And that's why we might look like we're going to World War III. That would be deeply unfortunate if that were the case. And I think that Marxists and socialists have to be careful to adapt, to not merely adapt, I should say, to this kind of trend, but be aware of the more long-term history, and to recognize that even when capitalism goes through a nationalistic phase or a particularistic phase, that is its form of universalism. That is its form of globalism. And it doesn't change the task at hand, which is that we workers of the world unite. Like that still is the task. And I think it's a spontaneous thing, meaning I think that if there were a radical workers' movement calling for greater socialism in China today, it would be deeply inspirational for people around the world. It would inspire people in India, the United States, Europe, Africa, Latin America. It would inspire people in the Middle East. It would. Similarly, since I'm American, I will say if we were to reestablish a working class based socialist movement in the United States, it would be inspirational for people in China and Africa and Latin America and Europe and Russia and the Middle East. And so that's just obvious. It's obvious. It's the same way that like Trumpites are inspired by Dugin. You
Well,
know?
that's
Well,
the MAGA, the MAG. I know I know the guy who's leading the MAGA communism thing is deeply inspired by Dugin, so it is connected to that. But what's coming to my mind is the talk you had with Nina Power, where you're talking about left and right, and
hmm
this model that you're proposing of liberal and nationalist capitalism could be, it sounds a lot like what you were calling progressive and conservative capitalism, like that they're just
right.
what we call left and right today is just two different modes of capitalism, where I guess the liberal capitalism would be the left orientation, which is increasingly, you know uh let's say,
Waning
waning.
or
Yeah, exactly.
incomplete.
Whereas the
Complete.
nationalist capitalism is the right wing
Right.
capitalism, which is in some sense, and it's hard to interpret whether when something goes quote unquote viral, is it a good thing or a bad thing, in the sense, is it just exhausting itself, and there's nothing
hmm
to worry about, or actually is this a sign of the future? And I do keep an eye on sort of um, viral accounts on Twitter, just to sort of track the ideology, and I see a lot of viral accounts on Twitter that are not just a little bit Nazi,
Oh
like
yeah.
but like
Oh yeah.
very Nazi, like very Nazi, and like you go down that rabbit hole and you're like, oh my god, and like this is getting a lot of attention. So, but I wanted to I want to point this to something that you were just mentioning about the what I see as a coordination issue for
Uh-huh.
for the way you're thinking about workers of the world unite, and you brought up the coordination issue in regards to, like, say, the Russian workers seizing the means of the production, but they can't seize the means of production in America. They would need American workers to seize the means of production. And this is reminding me of a problem that I've been tarrying with, what I would call a certain impossibility that I've been tarrying with in my own work. And I also brought this up with Benjamin Studebaker, is
hmm
basically I've been tarrying with Thomas Piketty's idea of the global state and the idea of a
hmm
global wealth tax. And basically, here, sort of him positing this as an ideal, but it's kind of like this impossible ideal, in the sense that, Studebaker's saying it would require the coordination of too many governments, to all agree on the same policies, and to be able to form some sort of supranational agreement that would be able to, as it were, constrain capital mobility. And it seems like there's a similar problem with the idea of, now, my criticism of the idea of Piketty and the global state is actually that it's not a qualitatively different solution to the national solutions that were proposed in the 20th century. It's kind of like taking the national solutions in the 20th century and proposing them on a global scale, but also not sort of theorizing the way in which those national solutions in the 20th century were intimately related to the world wars. And so
Right, right.
any type of global state coordination on the level of capital mobility would presumably be a response to some sort of World War III breakout, and some sort of way to respond to that negativity. But here, just thinking in terms of the qualitatively different dimension that's being introduced with the idea of seizing the means of production on the level of labor, how is there any good literature? Is there any sort of theorization in your own work about how something like that would even happen?
Well, no, so I have not I haven't done much like positive theory in my own writing because I've been so concerned with like trying to dispel a lot of misapprehensions about Marxism and about the socialist history that I think, is still haunting us, but we're not clear about. If I could return to something that you mentioned earlier about like conservative capitalism versus progressive capitalism, there was in the not so distant past, it's not like within my lifetime, or it's only marginally in my lifetime, Nationalism would have been seen as progressive, and a kind of liberal laissez-faire capitalism would be seen as conservative. So I think that right now it looks like the opposite, right? It looks like, because the people who call themselves progressives are actually now quite conservative, meaning they want to keep the status quo and are quite resistant to the populist upsurge. And, so they're progressive as regards neoliberalism, meaning when neoliberalism was progressive, they're progressives like that. And now they're trying to be conservative and keep that. Whereas the people who are trying to change things are the nationalists. And so that, even though it doesn't go with our popular parlance, they could just as legitimately claim that they're the true progressives, right? That the nationalists are the progressives. And so the political realignment and beyond left and right, it's all about that, right? So for a good part of the 20th century, nationalism would have been seen as progressive, and a kind of laissez-faire liberalism would have been seen as conservative. In the neoliberal globalizing era, laissez-faire capitalism, liberal capitalism, globalized capitalism was seen as progressive, as opposed to the nation state, which was seen as stuck in the past. Whereas now, the people who want to change things from the status quo are advancing in the name of nationalism, which means that the formerly progressive neoliberal globalists actually might now be the real conservatives because they're trying to keep the status quo. Now, as far as the Piketty global state, well, of course there is a global state. The problem is that it's become ineffectual, meaning there was this Washington consensus, there was the IMF, there was. That is a world state, right? There was a lot of coordination among different national governments politically that was able to achieve that. I kind of feel like when I'm dealing with younger people, it's like, well, maybe this is before your time, so you're not aware of the fact, right? So it's not like, oh, it's impossible to have that much international political coordination. Actually, it's very possible, and they did do it. The problem is that it failed in the 2008 crisis. So it's not that we're going to abandon the world state and go back to the nation state. It's that the world state needs to be reformed, and that the impulse for that reform is going to come from nation states. So I mean, BRICS, which is already old, right? BRICS is a kind of alter globalization idea, and which now is seen as multipolarity and some kind of anti-globalization idea. But it is an attempt to coordinate among very different political systems. Communist China, capitalist Brazil, capitalist India, capitalist Russia. So I feel that they are going to achieve some kind of global state, international political, economic coordination. They are. They're muddling through now to a new way of doing it because the old way has proved inadequate to deal with the problems. But they're going to do that. It can't be undone. And it's not the model for, proletarian socialist world revolution, but it does show that left to its own devices, capitalism is spontaneously headed in the same direction. Now, to get back to what we were talking about earlier, the more utopian radical goal of Marxism is to overcome the state. So, in other words, a socialist world state would immediately wither away. In other words, it would be necessary in order to help effect the transition out of capitalism, but that's not the end goal. That's not the end goal. Again, I feel that in the era of the crisis of neoliberalism that has characterized the millennial left and now the Zoomer left, I think that it can look like, we want politics as opposed to laissez-faire liberal capitalism. We want the state as opposed to the free market bourgeois society that has failed us. There, it just becomes important to understand that neoliberalism was always statism, was always a statist project. We always relied a great deal on the state. And that, again, the original vision of socialism that animated Marxism was to recognize the state as the expression of a necessity in capitalism, the goal of which is to overcome, like to overcome that necessity. Right. So insofar as capitalism needs a world state, it's going to have a world state. It has a world state. But the point is to bring the world to a point where we don't need that. Again, the diverse multiplicity. So you can't just build out from like where we are right now to that kind of beyond the state. However, we shouldn't lose sight of that goal, because I think that really the turn of the millennial left where it gave up its ambition was just to say, fuck it, yes, the Tea Party is right, Obama is socialism, and we want more of that. Now, the Trump phenomenon, since we're living through the third election of Trump, that basically the crossover of the social democratic imagination with, yes, the elites have just taken advantage of the system, but the system, the state, should serve the people. It shouldn't just serve the elites, it should serve the people. Right? That's the affinity between like Bernie and Trump. That's the affinity between left and right populism. That's both aspiring for a kind of statism, and it's opposed to the current form of statism, which is associated with globalization. And so it can look like nationalism. I just don't think it's going to be quite that. I don't think that it can be. And, I always like to say, when the U.S. was carpet bombing Nazi Germany, it was blowing up American-owned factories. And the American factory owners were repaid by the U.S. government for their losses in World War II. Even Nazi Germany was part of a global capitalist system indissolubly connected to the United States. Countries at war are still connected by capitalism. That doesn't end. That doesn't stop. Right? Even like the autarky of the East, of the Soviet communist model, it was not nearly as insulated as hyper-nationalist. It was maybe more nationalist successfully than the Nazis were. But even then, it was always connected to the greater global civilization. And it was part of a global political system. The United Nations. The Cold War always had the United Nations.
So, in regards to this weird flipping of left and right that we're experiencing today, and that you brought up in regards to the progressives now are much more on the side of neoliberalism, whereas the conservatives are much more on the side of nationalism. And in the past, this would have been the opposite situation. Yep. It sounds to me like this brings me to the point where I wanted to talk about basically what the left has become since the 1960s, because it seems to me like since the 1960s, the way in which the left thinks or conceives of what you're calling diverse multiplicity is in terms of cultural, racial, ethnic, gender terms, and in some sense has this let's say, anti-nationalist point of view, which has now led to sort of an identification with a global plurality, but without any political teeth, without any actual socialist political teeth.
Right.
And so in this, is there a way in which thinking from the point of view of diverse multiplicity has to also inscribe a certain antagonism into that multiplicity, where the left does need to, and I'm not denying that this is very difficult, but that the left needs to dialectically think the ethical system of family, community, and state. Here I'm thinking about Hegel's idea of family, community, and state as the ethical system. For Hegel, that's the true. And do we lose something by not dialectically engaging family, community, and state? Is that wrong-headed thinking in your point of view?
No, I mean, I think that the problem is what the actual content of it is, right? So, and again, that's a bourgeois view. So that is inevitably our view, meaning when we're thinking about politics, we are thinking about what are the social relations, what is the form of the constitutional, legal, juridical, political order, the state, and we are thinking about the family. Of course we are. We're thinking about kinship structures. We're talking about like formal, legally recognized relations between people. Um, so we're talking about like property relations, family relations, political relations vis-a-vis the state, right? And I will just say that Vichy France replaced liberty, equality, and fraternity on all the currency with um, like nation, family, and faith, I think. Maybe property. Maybe nation, family, and property.
All right. So, in terms where you were talking about basically, okay, thinking about, let's say, family, community, and state is bourgeois. Again, do we find ourselves in this polar inversion between left and right, at least on the level of capitalism, in part because there is kind of like a conception of diverse multiplicity that um, doesn't engage this reality. I mean, I'm trying to think about if something like MAGA communism, for example, is a result of the left kind of not
Failing. Yes.
including within its thought this dimension. I'm thinking, for example, about Daniel Tutt's work on the family, the psychoanalysis of the family, where he's basically arguing that we need to think about the family as a part of an emancipatory process as opposed to an emancipatory process.
Right. So the family is ineradicable. It's just a basic reality. It's
Exactly,
an
exactly.
anthropological, truth. And yet we do experience the existing established official family form as oppressive at the same time. So what we're looking at is not like simple negation of that, but it's transformation. And so I'm always very much inspired by Juliet Mitchell, who was we could say, Marxist feminist or feminist Marxist of the 1960s. She wrote a wonderful essay that became the basis of a couple of different books, Women, the Longest Revolution, where she simply pointed out the point is not to abolish the family per se, but to allow for different kinds of families. So, again, can we bear that? Or does it
I think
seem
that's a
like
no. I totally think, yeah, that's very clear.
it is? Now, you could say, oh, well, we got that. We got gay marriage. Well, actually, no, we didn't, because we got like basically the what Mitchell called the oppressive monolithic simple family form extended to gay people. And that meant that it is a kind of legal recognition and therefore a kind of an emancipation, but at the same time it's within very narrow conservative terms. So that again, the struggle for freedom would be not just to join the bourgeois nuclear family, but to overcome it. But then what if we want to join it? Right? So that's why it's not a simple matter of abolition. And yet it is liable to be seen as that. Now the right, save the family, right? That also needs to be understood as a desire for freedom, meaning save the family as a refuge from the heartless capitalist world, right? The
And
Christopher
that's
Lasch
what
idea.
that's what Daniel Tutt references with regard to Christopher Lasch.
Mm-hmm. Now, what this means is that again, left and right, I do think that the left is defined by the aspiration for freedom. But what do we mean by that? Meaning that generally the right denies freedom, the possibility of freedom, and the left, really pushes the envelope on the possibilities. At the same time, I'm not sure that our conventional notions of left and right in capitalist politics today really do correspond to that distinction. And insofar as they don't, then we would say there's got the rational kernel on the right is in its desire for freedom. There's also Wilhelm Reich infamously said that one must recognize the progressive character of fascism, meaning that fascism is also the desire for freedom, that the left had failed, that the Marxist left had failed to fulfill. So, I mean, it is in a grotesque, distorted, and very misrecognized way, but that is its actual historical content. That's where it's coming from. That is its true aspiration, even though it doesn't know it. So, save the family, abolish the family, two sides of the same coin. Because we're really looking for a qualitative transformation in the possibilities of family life.
Yeah, I
Right?
mean, I'm totally in agreement with that. And that's been the way I've been trying to conceptualize it. It's just because that's a dialectical conception of family. It's actually it's very easy for the save versus the abolish the family discourse to gain cultural credibility
Traction.
because
Yep.
it's very easy to articulate that. But
Simplistic.
it's
Yep.
it's very simplistic, but that catches on. I mean, and that's what that gets the views and that gets the clicks, and so that becomes the culture war. And you have like I don't want to bring up all these specific culture war points, but you've got the figures like Matt Walsh, who can make these
Yep.
documentaries that get a lot of attention and that inflame divisions as opposed to actually articulating a different dialectical conception of family. And it really puts what I would call like the brainy left, or like the dialectical left into a really difficult spot, and it's hard to know what to do in that position, because I feel like I've been in this position for approaching 10 years now, where I can't necessarily identify with what calls itself the left today, but in terms of my sensibilities I see myself as still dialectically in a sense left, and specifically the idea of the what you were bringing up in your book. And I think this does come from the 1960s, and we could connect this to the death of the millennial left, in the sense of the millennial left not really reinventing itself sufficiently. It's still sort of in the aftermath of the 1960s, and that this privileging and this thinking of cultural differences, racial differences, gender differences, without having a political dimension. I think you say in the book they evacuate the entire political dimension. And
Yep.
what would it mean to ground the importance of, like, I think you expressed it very well in regards to the family, that we don't want to abolish the family. We want to make space for a broader conception of what family is, something like that. And
Right.
how do we
So I think that
reintroduce the political to this multiplicity?
because I think that the left becomes partisan in the realm of capitalist politics. It's really as simple as that. And I think that a renewed socialist movement grounded in the working class would have to cut across the differences in capitalist politics. Right? So to say the workers should be free to conduct their family life however they choose is very different from immediately saying which policy do you support? Those offered by the progressives or those offered by the conservatives or the Republicans or the Democrats. It's rather to say, actually, we want both and neither of those things. And, that socialists aren't there to tell the working class what the family should be for them, one way or the other, right?
Hmm.
So, of course, you want to expand the realm of individual choice, but you also want to expand the realm of collective choice and, social and legal recognition of what people want to do. So, very liberal in that sense. Because I think that it came up with like gay marriage. It's like, oh, well, what's next? Polygamy? And I feel like, why not? Leave it alone. Meaning, if the Mormon sects or if the Muslims want to have polygamous marriage, let it go. Let it alone. Let the state leave it alone.
Well, the
Because,
actually, as
you know,
the sort of the political talking point or weaponization in that dimension I saw was, I mean, got quite ridiculous with suggesting what's next, bestiality.
yeah. Well, because that's not illegal. It's not like a legal relation, right? Like, in other words, like, yes, you can leave your wealth to your cat when you die, but like, no, because obviously the cat's not a legal subject. Now, of course, so I brought up polygamy, and that's like, of course, very provocative because that's associated with oppression of women, traditional patriarchy, etc., etc. Of course it is. But the thing is, what do you imagine? You imagine that the state is going to liberate Mormon women or Muslim women from their communities? Is that how you see freedom? Freedom's going to be the state coming in? That's not freedom, you know? That's not the freedom that socialists struggle for. Meaning, struggles for socialism have to do with the people themselves liberating themselves, not the state liberating them. No, right? So, you know, it's like, because then it's going to be like, well, okay, the state is here to say traditional Muslim or traditional Mormon marriage is illegal, and we're going to suppress it. That's not good, right? And because it's going to reinforce the kind of insularity and cultural conservatism of the community, so, and things might be practiced informally. In other words, they might still be practiced, but just invisibly under the radar, you know? So I think that, again, the the intellectual left likes to think that it's like policy wonks or something, that they're gonna like figure it all out. They're gonna figure out the proper philosophy. They're gonna figure out the proper like political policy. That it's the war of talking points. What about this? What about that? No, right? That this is how we've become like farcical adjuncts of capitalist politics. Right? We're not like trying to be the more educated bureaucrats. At least we ought not to be. Of course we are trying to be that. But that's bad, and we should stop doing that. You know?
So in regards to, let's bring it back to, let's say, the concept of the working class and um, labor movements. And I know you're emphasizing the social dimension of it, but let's say labor is very different than it was 150 years ago. And I want to bring up what you think about technological automation. Do you think that that could be some sort of um, political dimension, which becomes then socially mobilized for a different type of political movement?
I mean, I think that basically the working class has been responding to automation from the beginning of the industrial era. So, like Luddism, the Luddites. So is freedom smashing the machines, or is freedom having labor replaced by machines? It's neither of those things, and it's both of those things. Meaning, technology is a potentially emancipating force that is an oppressive force in capitalism. Meaning, if you take away people's ability to earn a livelihood, I think that the understanding is, again, it's a very technocratic, statist, bureaucratic mindset, is less, yes, let's automate all the labor away and force the state to give everyone a UBI. Well, that might work for some Scandinavian countries, or it might work for some municipalities. That's not going to work on a global level. At a global level, right? So that's, again, I wrote in my book, Robots in Sweatshops. You never have one without the other. You never have one without the other, including in countries. Meaning, you could give a UBI to all American citizens, and that just means that the illegal workers are going to do the sweatshop labor in one's own country, or it's going to be done in another country, right? But that's not it, right? Because if you do a UBI, it's always going to be limited to some people. It's not actually going to be available to people who just show up. That's politically never going to happen. So again, it might happen in some like corner of some very wealthy portion of the world where the local capitalists are willing to spend the money on that in order to have their ideal model community. They could try that in San Francisco, but it's not even going to be done even at that scale. So I think that's the idea. The idea is, why can't we just automate everything? Why can't we just give everyone a UBI? Yeah, that's not how it's going to happen. It's not going to happen that way. And it certainly is going to happen that way on a global level, but it's even not going to happen on a national level. It's not.
Mhm.
I mean, I hate to,
So
just get very real,
no, I've
but,
always
you
thought
know,
I've always thought UBI. I always thought UBI was a lazy idea. I have been paying attention to some people who are more proposing UBS, Universal Basic Services, but I'm assuming that you would be opposed to that on the grounds that it's a state level solution.
sure. I mean, that would be, well, let's put it this way. It would be a problem at that level. Like, I'm not talking about being like for or opposed to it. It might happen. In which case, would socialist organizing be about organizing against it? No, but it would be about the political terms of it, right? And so you'd want to assert as much popular control as opposed to bureaucratic state control as possible. But that would probably be woefully inadequate. Meaning, again, when we're thinking of it at like a local level, like you need the state to do anything. Well, what about what's over the local state, like the city government? Not just the national government, but the larger capitalist reality. So it's I think that our imagination is very constrained because we are thinking which policies should we favor and which should we oppose, rather than understanding that all these policy recipes are going to be attempts to manage capitalism. And it does matter then who's doing it. Meaning the same policy done by a technocratic, bureaucratic capitalist state has a very different substance and content than the dictatorship of the proletariat trying to do it, than the working class trying to do it. And I think we've given up on that. I think that we've just assumed, well, the working class is just a sort of passive object and sort of recipient of largesse or victim of abuse. But we just assume, well, of course, in the ideal world they would control things, but that's not really feasible. We have to bring things to a point where that might be feasible. In other words, right now, of course, it's not feasible. But, transforming society out of capitalism is not going to be an instantaneous thing. So that's, again, we have to introduce a different sort of time horizon, a different geographical horizon, a different time horizon to what we're after.
Well, I know in some of your recent podcasts, and you've even said in this conversation that you tend away from positive policy proposals and are staying more with the negativity, and even to the point where in a talk that I listened to with you and Alex Grant, that
Right.
there was even this idea that the term Marxism today gets in the way, and that theory and praxis has been separated so deeply. Um, it sounded to me like you would tend away from even using that term Marxism. Now, I mean, to say the book we're talking about is called Marxism and
Right.
Politics, but
Right.
in that talk, you were saying, less Marxist and more socialist, and of course, everyone knows you're kind of the last Marxist, at least the brand of the
Right.
last,
Uh-huh.
the
For
brand of
better
the
or
last.
for worse.
So
Yep.
so yeah so what's going on in your thought with this move? Are you sort of
There are different
saying that
audiences and there are different audiences and there are different tasks. And so this writing that I've done in Platypus over the last couple of decades has been aimed at the leftist intelligentsia and the would-be socialist or would-be Marxist intelligentsia. And, it's the kind of thing that one can do through writing. Organizing a socialist movement can't be done primarily through writing. It can't be done primarily through propagating ideas. It has to be done much more practically, organizationally. And there, the issue is sufficient scale. And so you can't achieve that sufficient scale if you start out with ideological divisions. Because the one thing that defines Marxism in our time and for a good ways going back historically is that it is defined by its internal controversies, its internal divisions. So Marxism separates people, it doesn't unite people. Now, inevitably. And maybe it
Well,
always did.
I get a lot of pushback. I get a lot of push. There are some people who are close to Philosophy Portal that they draw a hard line whenever I bring up Marxism because they say it's a type of satanic scapegoating.
Well, certainly if Marxism means hate the bourgeoisie or hate the capitalist class, yeah, then it is. Then of course it is. And it quite certainly is. So I was in a panel discussion last week about the election, and I was on the panel with a member of the American Communist Party who was a participant in Midwestern Marx and is associated, therefore, now with MAGA communism in some way. And someone in the audience brought up anti-Semitism controversy in their milieu among their members. And so the speaker, is Eddie Liger Smith. He defended his comrade against the charge of anti-Semitism, but then laid out, well, it's not the Jews, it's finance capital. And I just had my old professor Moish Pistone in the back of my mind. I almost had to bite my tongue and say, well, that's just structural anti-Semitism as opposed to racial anti-Semitism. Right. So it's, in other words, if you just say the problem is the money bags, the problem is finance capital, the problem is the plutocratic elite, the billionaire parasites, then that is a kind of anti-Semitism anyway, because you're suddenly going to discover the disproportionate presence of Jews in that part of society. And so it's structural anti-Semitism. Also, it's the stigmatization of a group as if they are the problem. No, the problem is capitalism, and that problem is located in the practice of the working class, meaning what the working class is doing on a daily basis is what is constituting and reconstituting and reproducing capitalism. Right? That's not to blame the workers. That's not the point. But the point is, you also should not you should neither beg nor condemn the capitalists. Right? They can't help but be what they are. And the only way to change capitalism is not to change the behavior of the capitalists, but to change social production, which means changing the behavior of the workers. And that's a long-term project. And it's not a cultural project. It's a political project. And it's not about making an ethical appeal to individuals. You
In
know?
your book, in your book, you say, and I want to say that you state this explicitly in the book Marxism and Politics, where you say what's misrecognition here is blaming the exploitation of the capitalist rather than the historical undermining of social value of labor as the source of value. So just getting this right, it seems to me like it could be that Marxism can get labeled as a sort of satanic form of scapegoating because there is a dimension of the human being that gets a excess enjoyment from scapegoating and finding sort of a simplistic category to blame everything on,
The
and
enemy.
what's much an enemy, yeah, an obstacle enemy, and we get a lot of enjoyment from that. And so I
Mm,
think that perhaps that's one of the issues. And then on the other issue is like, well, actually changing the way we socially value labor and changing the way we work and engaging in that long, arduous process. Well, that's much more difficult. It's much more easy. It's much easier to blame, the
hmm.
parasite billionaire class, for example.
That's right. Exactly. So I think that, again, my concern in my writings has been the ideology of a would-be socialist intelligentsia. And I do think that their kind of pseudo-Marxism has been an obstacle to them seeing reality. It's been ideological in that bad way, a blinder. And so I have really set myself the task of disenchanting people of that quote unquote Marxist ideology, which I think prevents them from seeing social reality and its real possibilities. Its organizing possibilities, its ultimate political possibilities. I think that Marxism gets in the way of that. At the same time, I think there's a reason why people reach back to historical Marxism. I think it still does speak to us. So it hasn't been invalidated. But again, it's paradoxical or self contradictory, the way that Marxism seems to be true. And then you have these opposed varieties of Marxism, inevitably. The way that I like to put it is the 20th century, the history of the division in Marxism. Believe it or not, Marxism or ostensible Marxism or people who thought of themselves as Marxists very sincerely and rigorously, they were on every side of every issue. There were homophobic Marxists, there were queer liberation Marxists, there were traditional family Marxists, there were abolish the family bohemian Marxists, there were Marxists who supported fascism, there were Marxists who opposed fascism, there were Marxists who thought that colonialism was the way to liberate the world, there were anti-colonial Marxists. Marxists on every side of the issue. There were Marxists who were very anti-racist. There were Marxists who thought that race is a material category, and therefore Marxist materialism has to accept the reality of race. So Marxists have been on every side of every issue. What does that mean? It means Marxism is not free of the ideological effects of real social contradictions. Marxism is not free of misrecognition. Right? So, again, I think that it is a mistake to say what's the right kind of Marxism. It is. And that's a lesson that I had to learn as a Marxist. I had to learn, oh, it's not about the right kind of Marxism versus the wrong kind of Marxism in terms of like positions or theoretical descriptions or what's real versus what's epiphenomenal. It's not as simple as that, unfortunately. And so it means rewinding things back to when, in fact, people were not divided in quite these same ways and understood that Marxism had to ride a contradiction rather than try to adjudicate it. I just recently was talking with students about abortion. And Lenin very famously said, of course, socialists, working class socialists, should be for the decriminalization of contraception and abortion. Workers should have access to these things because the ruling class does. And these things are always selectively enforced, so it should be available, decriminalized, yes? But he said, of course, the working class wants more than the right to not have children. They want more than the right to, kill their unborn children. Right? They want the right to be able to have families, to be able to have children. And it's only bourgeois pessimists who see freedom only in terms of contraception and abortion. Right? So which side of the culture war divide, pro anti-abortion, was he on? He wasn't on either side. He had a civil libertarian attitude about these things, but he also took a kind of morally agnostic view, but also a view of, well, real freedom means reproductive freedom in a positive sense, not only in a negative sense. What is that? Is that going to strike people as like, oh, well, he's like an old-fashioned conservative Marxist or something? No, that's still true of the working class today. That's
So
not going to change.
So talking about things that might not change, and here sort of I want to ask a kind of a metaphysical question, which is not only inspired by, I brought him up a few times today, but not only inspired by the work of Robert C. Tucker, but also inspired by my own sort of experience with both Christianity and Marxism. I want to ask a metaphysical question, because one of the weird experiences I've had is that and maybe this is one of the reasons why I appreciate your work, is that I've actually never been on the inside of strong identification with either Christianity or Marxism. I've never like walked around as that as my primary identity. And
Mm-hmm.
whenever I've found myself around people who I would call like either fundamentalist Christians or fundamentalist Marxists, I can sometimes get the same type of affective feeling, like I'm in terms of some ideology being presupposed and imposed onto
True
me.
believers. True
True
believers.
believers, right? I've never been that type of true believer. But at the same time, I've appreciated and learned many things from both Christianity and Marxism. Like, for example, just acting out, for example, the ethic of loving the other or loving the neighbor is just it's a difficult ethic, but it's a good ethic. And the same thing with what you're saying about organizing and rethinking about social labor and the value of social labor. That's difficult, but it's super important. And one of the things that I was always that really it, it it maybe fundamentally changed my life in my 20s, just the emphasis that we should feel at home and love our work, and that we don't have to put up with alienated labor, that's an important
Mm-hmm.
determination to give yourself to. And then also thinking about kind of these metaphysical structures as kind of essential parts of the historical metaphysical process in the West, with ideas of kind of like an eschatological orientation. With in Christianity you have like the kingdom of God, and obviously in Marxism you have world communism. And Robert Tucker brings these things together in an interesting way in his book, Karl Marx and
Mm-hmm.
the Philosophy of Myth. I wanted to get your opinion on how do you read the coordinates of a conversation between Christianity and Marxism? And does that come up in your work and maybe in your future work on art? Does that have any play in your thinking?
I mean, it doesn't very much. However, what I would say, just as a kind of baseline idea, well, first of all, I'd have to say we must admit and maybe even concede that the Christians have almost 2,000 years advantage, historical head start on Marxism, right? So, I mean, the fact that
Can I say
ancient
with that?
religions. Yeah.
Can I just say
Mm-hmm.
very quickly on that I think you've addressed this distinction very well in a podcast in regards to Badiou and ancient communism, where Badiou makes this distinction that communism goes back 2,000 years or more, but actually
Mm-hmm.
you were saying proletarian socialism can only be seen as 200 years old because of the conditions of socialism as a process of transforming capitalism. So I want to say that this
Yes,
distinction is alive in your work.
that's right. That's right. So, I don't think that, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg famously said that communism would be the fulfillment of all the ancient religions and philosophies, right? Um, Now, yes, that I agree with that. Meaning, as a kind of a positive content, it would be a redemption of all of history in secular historical time, at least potentially, or that should be the goal. Now, again, Marxism is not going to satisfy certain kinds of questions, and maybe it shouldn't try to. right? It shouldn't try to sort of do its version of eschatology in that way. Maybe these things are kind of incommensurate. And what that would mean is that it's not a matter of forcing people to abandon their religion in order to struggle for socialism. No, right? Which again, the left as a subculture, the left reduced to a subculture rather than a force for changing the world, does seem to be a cultural affinity proposition in which you have to be a Marxist, not a Christian, or something like that. And, I'm not, I think that that's a sort of almost inevitable condition that we're in. And we just have to be careful about that because that is a kind of, are you a philosopher or a theologian? Right? Are you a metaphysician or are you a scientist? Something like that. And it's like, well, it's not an either or. These are really different objects, different things, different disciplines, different pursuits. And so, you know, Marxism is pretty barren at a number of levels, right? If you're looking for a kind of existential philosophy, you know, that would involve a great deal of distortion of Marxism to try to provide that, I think. And so, at the same time, it's not unrelated to other things, right? I'm just thinking of like the debates of our time, like the new atheism. I saw this kind of a sad debate between I think it was Richard Dawkins and it was Hirsi Ali. I forget her first name.
I
She's
watched that.
the
I and her Shelley. Yeah, I watched that.
yeah, and about her becoming Christian, right? And I just thought this is like a sad debate, really.
It was sad.
You
Yeah.
know, right? And I just thought this is just not good, and I felt a lot more sympathetic to her than to him.
Because I think Richard Dawkins, he's abstractly a humanist,
Right.
but he's not. There's no effective dimension there, or seemingly
What he
very
what
little.
he claimed
Yeah,
what he claimed in that debate was, I don't care about humanity, I care about truth.
he
And I
said
thought,
that
well,
in the
that's
debate with Peterson as well.
yeah, and I just thought this is a theological assertion, actually.
Yeah, no, he said that he cares about truths independent of human existence, and I think that that's an incredible metaphysical and theological presupposition for
Right.
someone like Dawkins to be holding. So that anyway,
That he
but I really,
denies.
I
Right.
think that the point that I want to emphasize in what you just said is that a lot of let's say leftist subculture thinks that in order to be Marxist you can't be Christian, or a lot of Christians think that if they're Christians they can't also be socialist or Marxist. And I think that what I'm trying to do with the Christian atheism course is explode that. Like I think that's actually something that undermines both positions.
Yeah.
I think it undermines leftist subculture and it undermines the potentially socialist dimension, or even necessarily socialist dimension of Christian theology.
Yes, it does. Right. I'm reminded of the old adage of Jesus, render unto Caesar what Caesar is due, render unto God what God is due. And Auguste Comte, you know, the great utopian socialist positivist philosopher of science, he said that actually the liberation of science would not have been able to happen without that Christian distinction between the temporal and the eternal, or between the religious and the political.
Absolutely. That precondition, that sort of civilizational precondition is often missed by again here using just Dawkins as an archetype of a certain position.
Right. And so that does not mean, oh, well, the West is uniquely atheistic. Right. It's, in other words, you could see it as internal to theology. I mean, certainly when Jesus said that, it was internal to theology.
Absolutely. And there's so many funny little paradoxes here with the early Christian communities being perceived as atheists.
Right. Of
But
course, because
you
by comparison to the established religions, they were atheist.
well, the joke I work with a theologian. His name's Peter Rollins, and the joke he always says is the early Christians were not only seen as atheists because they disbelieved in the Roman gods, but because they disbelieved in their own God.
Oh yeah, yeah, because belief in God, exactly. Well, the Jews, the traditional, the Israelite authorities also considered them to be blasphemers and therefore atheists. And I mean, I'll just use this. This is a very cheesy anecdote, but there's a guy whose father was one of the founders of Hamas, who and fled via conversion to Christianity. But then what he decided was, and he's been interviewed in mainstream media a lot, especially after October 7th. What he said was that what he learned from Christianity is that Jesus had redeemed humanity from religion. And there is a truth to that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, that's it's very intimately connected to what I'm trying to do with the Christian atheism course. That's exactly yeah, that's exactly the idea. Well, the slogan of the course is that I don't know if you'll agree with the first presupposition, but it is that Christianity is the truth of religion and atheism is the truth of Christianity. So
Yes.
there's this idea that actually there's a religionless dimension of Christianity built into Christianity itself, which is of course hyper ironic if you think about that historically, but nevertheless trying to bring out
No,
that
this is
historical
Hegel.
irony. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
This is
also yeah,
Hegel.
deep.
This
Yeah.
is Hegel.
Anyway, so
And therefore
reading
also Marx.
yeah. So reading philosophy from that point of view, um, starting with Kant, working through Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and many 20th century figures, I think there's a really interesting project internal to modern philosophy that could be conceived as a Christian atheist project, and I do think has ramifications for socialist politics. And so anyway, I'm trying to bring that out. I just wanted to give that as a final question or line of thought to see what you thought about that. But it's interesting to see that there's a connection there. I guess
Absolutely.
as a sort of final closing thought, maybe just give the listeners a sort of sense of Marxism and politics as a whole, what you're trying to do with that book, and what you're someone who's interested in taking on the labor of reading this book because it is a massive book. Um, what what type of individual are you trying to call forth in that book, and what transformative process are you trying to evoke with this book?
Well, okay, so these were essays, so it's got like bite-sized chunks. So you can read it essay by essay. It doesn't demand being read completely, although it is structured to be able to be read from cover to cover in a productive way. What I'm trying to do is open up the history of Marxism and its own historical roots in pre-Marxist politics and pre-Marxist philosophy. And so really it's about treating Marxism not as a resolution of problems, not as a answer to questions, but as still containing questions and problems that are alive, that are still with us, and that are living questions and problems. So I do think that the only point in remembering Marxism is for the problems and questions it raises rather than the answers and solutions people might be looking for. So I think that if Marxism is looked to provide answers and solutions, that's uh, a kind of a closing down that I would caution people against. I know that people do want answers and they do want solutions, but maybe we first have to formulate the nature of the problem and the questions better, and that Marxism, its real value is in doing that. What do we even mean by capitalism? What kind of a problem is capitalism? Why do we live in a democratic and liberal political and social system where that liberalism and that democracy fails continuously? and we're constantly dealing with the pathology of that failure. And that does not mean we can go back to some kind of traditional, like theocratic, monarchical state or something, because we can't. We can try, but it won't work. And so again, what are the historical roots of the problems we're dealing with today, and how does Marxism provide access to that? So my various essays in the book are different windows, different angles on that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I think that for me, anyway, opening up that historical angle of things allows me to get some distance to my own a priori frame of reference that I've inherited growing up in the 90s and the 2000s, where I couldn't help but be conditioned by certain ways of thinking about, for example, left and right, or certain ways of thinking about progressivism and conservatism, or certain ways of thinking about the state and the market, that I think that, especially going back to the crises of the revolutions in the French Revolution and the 1848 Revolution, and sort of seeing the nature of those crises and the way in which you draw out those historical political lineages in the context of those crises, I think it's incredibly valuable. So I really, really
Thank you.
appreciate you for doing that, and look forward to your future work, of course, on art. And for the people who are still with us, the link to Chris Cutrone's book will be in the description. I highly recommend checking out Marxism and Politics. I'll give you the last word, Chris, and then we'll wrap up for the evening.
Right, so I do think that we are not quite done with Marxism, that people will return to it in the future. So we have gone through a phase and of a return to Marxism that surprised me as a kind of generation of like the end of Marxism, Gen X, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of Marxism. There was a return, and we might be playing that out now, but it likely will come back again in the future. So I have written, what I've written for my contemporaries, for young people today. I'm collecting them now because I think we're in a reflective moment about these things. But I think that I also wrote it for the future, for posterity. And as you were just saying, again, Marxism, if it doesn't challenge people, like really deeply challenge people and make them think more, think again about things, then it's not very worthwhile. Meaning, if it stops people from thinking, if it resolves things so that people feel that they don't have to think anymore, that is not why we need Marxism. We need Marxism in order to open these things up, to think again, think more, and really confront and challenge our presuppositions about things, including presuppositions on the left and presuppositions among people who think of themselves as socialists and Marxists.
With that, it's been Cadell Last with Chris Cutrone, Marxism and Politics, for everyone who's been watching. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month, we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.